Lovely to be with you again, speaking to you from the from Bow, in the heart of the People's Republic of Tower Hamlets. But more of that later. Tonight we're going to devote our show to talking about Ukraine and a very serious situation there, and a very serious human situation as well. So we have a different person to talk to tonight. So I'd like to welcome Tom Harris, who is a member of the union PCS, but he's also somebody who's actually been to Ukraine. So let's get going. Tom, how do you get to Ukraine these days? You don't just go to Heathrow and pick up the next plane, I assume.
No, it was a bit of a trek. So we flew from London to Rzeszów, which is in eastern Poland, and then we got a coach across the border to Lviv, which is on the kind of extreme west of Ukraine. It's actually not a very long journey from Rzeszów to Lviv, but I think at the best of times, border crossings on coaches are a bit of a nightmare, let alone in the middle of a war. So we were originally planning to go on to Kiev, but we thought, in view of some renewed shelling of the city, as well as just the sheer amount of time it takes to get across a country that big, that we could probably achieve most of what we wanted to do in Lviv.
Well, probably we should start by talking a bit about Ukraine. I think most of us have discovered where it is on the map now since Russia invaded, and it's been in the news all the time. And it's a surprisingly large country, isn't it? Has it always had its current borders?
No, not at all. So for a long period of time, it was split between what was then the Russian Empire and what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But
the Austro-Hungarian Empire got as far as Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, doesn't it?
Well, Lviv, they're all about the shop. The city we went to, Lviv, used to be called Lvov, and it was a Polish city. But with the various population transfers and turmoil of the Russian Revolution and the Second World War, then Stalin, that moved around a lot. But so the Ukrainians were a kind of stateless nationality for centuries, and they only gained their independence in various forms in the 20th century.
Right. I think my grandfather fought in the Austro-Hungarian Empire's army, but I don't think he ever got that far.
No, maybe not.
So there we are. Here we are in 2022, and Ukrainians are sat there in Ukraine, where you think they must have been part of the Soviet Union at one stage.
Yeah.
And then after that fell apart and Russia emerged as a separate country, we're left there with Ukraine. And how did Ukraine go about its first 20 years of existence then as modern Ukraine? Did it just say, oh, let's go and join NATO, apply to the EU, be part of the West, or did it still have some ties with the East and Russia?
Very much still had ties with the East. It's a very poor country. I think even before the war started, it was the poorest country in Europe. And obviously its economy was very tied up with Russia. It'd been one of the Soviet Socialist republics of the USSR. And then I guess part of the story of the current conflict is there was a growing mood amongst many Ukrainians and some of the Ukrainian political class to try and get into the European Union, which I think was associated for many people with better living standards, with certain base levels of democracy and human rights. And it was the tangling back and forth over that direction that came to a head in 2014. So the president at the time, Yanukovych, was closely tied with Vladimir Putin. And when the attempts by some in the parliament to get Ukraine to move on a path that might eventually lead to it becoming a member of the EU, when Yanukovych thwarted that, it led to a big mass street movement in the Independence Square known as Maidan. And that's kind of the beginning of the road that leads us to where we are now.
Okay, so there's perhaps some hope. Some people would say illusion in the West and the gold-paved streets it has to offer. And that was thwarted by the then Prime Minister. And that sort of put the people on the on the offensive, and they went to try to follow their route. And then, of course, we had the election of the current president. Did that what did that symbolise politically?
Well, the interesting. So Zelensky is from a city called Kryvyi. I'm probably pronouncing that awfully. Ukrainian is non-existent.
Yeah, viewers, we're really sorry about our Ukrainian.
I can barely speak English. So
do phone in to correct us. Yes.
Well, and then I think it's a Russian majority speaking city, so they pronounce it in a whole other way. But he was elected basically from a Russian speaking city, and he was elected on two things. He thought he wanted to take on the oligarchs, the kind of ultra rich people who benefited from the privatization stuff after the fall of the Soviet Union. He wanted to tackle that kind of corruption. This is what he said, and he also wanted to try to come to some kind of a peace deal to sort out what was going on in the east of the country, where Russian troops had come in and backed separatist rebels. So this was the hope that there might be some kind of move against corruption, but also there might be some conclusion to the fighting in the east.
Okay, so that sounds like a couple of sort of progressive directions without being formally part of the established parties. Yeah. Viewers, do ring in with your questions if you have them. We can't promise to answer everything, and we will get on soon to Tom's recent trip to the Ukraine and what happened there, what he saw. But do ring in 0208 12345 07 if you'd like to ask us a question, or tell us your view on Ukraine as well. Okay, so we've got this new president and trying to get along, and then of course everything is just brought to a halt by this shocking invasion. I mean, have you speculated at all on what might have prompted Putin to invade in this way?
I think no one can really know for sure, because it all exists in Vladimir Putin's head and probably no one else. But I think some of the factors are, in Putin's mind and in the mind of a lot of Russian nationalists, Ukraine is part of their sphere of influence. It's a former colony of the Tsarist Empire. It was part of the Soviet Union. So any move by Ukraine to realign, whether that be to the EU, towards NATO, or even in a movement that, even in a direction that seems separate from what Russia would want, was going to be a problem. Putin is also, he's got his own domestic problems. He's got his own reasons to want to present himself as sort of a strong leader of the nation who can reclaim some of the lost glory. And why did he do it now? Well, again, hard to tell, but I imagine he thought that the cards were stacked in his favor. He'd been able to get away with a series of military actions elsewhere, in Georgia, in Syria, but also in the Donbass area of Ukraine. And I think from what we can tell about how the war went in that first month, he thought that what would happen is that they would be able to easily sweep into Kiev, the capital. The government would collapse or immediately come into talks. So it might be a relatively cheap, relatively cost-free in terms of money and lives way of scoring a diplomatic coup, restamping his authority in a former colony, and that it wouldn't be too much hassle. And obviously that's not actually how it turned out at all.
Yes. Okay. So, obviously that's something that really interests a lot of the East London community, is the way that the publicity has been given to Ukraine and what's happened there. Whereas, as you've just brought up Syria, the plight of the people in Syria is just really not in our mainstream news as much. But of interest, particularly because, of the links between the Muslim communities and the interest in those communities. It means a lot to people in East London. So for some reason, watching the war, which a lot of us were watching and which, a lot of us were very troubled by and saw the danger and the disruption to people's lives and the killing and the humanitarian disasters. So most of us were relieved and stayed home. You went there. What actually, I know you went not on your own, but with others as a delegation. Why did you want to do that?
Well, I think firstly because the opportunity arose. So there is a campaign based largely in France called, and I'm going to mess up the name now, but something like the European Conference of Solidarity with Ukraine. It's basically organised primarily by some left-wingers in France, and they arranged to try and get a grip, or try and get a group of trade unionists, left-wing journalists, left-wing parliamentarians, and activists to go there and to meet with our Ukrainian counterparts on opposite numbers, partially as a show of solidarity, to show that the Ukrainian people, and in particular the Ukrainian left, isn't alone, but also to try and begin to make some meaningful and practical links, and to work out how we can help. So I've been interested in what was going, horrified and interested in what was going on in Ukraine all along, but also my union, PCS, which is civil servants union, essentially, not exclusively, but essentially. We had kind of begun to take a bit of a lead amongst trade unions in trying to do something about Ukraine. So we'd organised a demonstration. The initial statements that our leadership put out were quite good. So I thought if I can join in on that trip, I might be able to find a way of helping get that process moving a little bit more, and trying to get the workers' movement in Britain to be of some use to workers in Ukraine.
I think we're getting some comments coming through on the Facebook.
Oh, there we go.
Yes. Yes, Edwin, you've written in to say in 2014, the democratically elected leader of Ukraine, I suppose, was hounded out. It has been said by the hounding out was done by US-backed influences.
Oh, crikey.
So, I mean, do you think the US has been trying to interfere in Ukraine just every bit as much as the USSR, or sorry, the Soviet Union? They're not called that anymore. Russia.
The artist formerly known as the Soviet Union.
Absolutely, old habits die hard. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of people, including people on the left, who've said it's not a surprise that Putin was worried, because the US were organising to influence Ukraine more and more, and that's why he felt threatened, which is not a justification for an invasion.
Sure.
But are you aware of any evidence of the US trying to interfere back in 2014 or since?
It's impossible for me to know. I imagine they were watching it very closely, as the Russian Secret Service were watching it very closely. They wouldn't be very good at their jobs if they weren't. The characterization of Yanukovych as a democratically elected president who was hounded out by the baying mob. I think if you look at the character of those protests, the sheer numbers of people who were involved with them, and the brutality with which they were crushed, snipers firing live rounds, scores and scores of people very badly injured, plenty of people killed. This isn't just a matter of a democratically elected president trying to go about its business. It's the vicious crushing of a huge protest movement.
This is in 2014.
In 2014, yeah, and if he was that popular, you'd expect all the subsequent presidential elections for his successors to have done well. That's not what's happened. And where has he gone? In fact, he's fled to Putin, a man not known for his respect for democratic norms at the best of times. And I think it tells you something about where his loyalties lie. But as you say, even if it were absolutely the case that this was all a kind of fabricated by CIA attempt to hound out a good man, that wouldn't even begin to justify the massacre and the invasion and the trammeling of democratic rights that has since been enacted by Russia in its invasion.
Absolutely, yes. That's I think that's an important point. But let's get on to your visit then. You've been back about a week or so, maybe a bit more. How long were you there for? How many of you went, and what did you see?
So there was 3 of us from Britain. I'm a terrible judge of numbers, but I think there must have been about maybe 30 people on the delegation as a whole, perhaps more. We were there for 4 or 5 days. And in terms of what we saw, well, we had the opportunity to look around a little bit around Lviv. People might be interested to know what that's like at the moment. I think it's fair to say it's not representative of the country as a whole. As I say, right in the west of the country, only 50 miles from the Polish border, and relatively unscathed by the war. I say relatively. The day before we arrived, some missiles hit the railway station, the railway outdoors, on the suburbs of the city, and the electricity went off. But generally speaking, when the air raid sirens go off to indicate that missiles are heading for Ukraine, they don't really hit Lviv. It's not a priority for Russia because it's so far away, and also their capacity to hit it has been much limited by the fact they've been so far away. So it feels bizarrely normal. You might think you're in, Krakow or some other sort of tourist city in Poland, perhaps. But obviously the signs are there that there is a war. You've got the military roadblocks, enlistment points everywhere. In the kind of beautiful old centre of the city, they've got sandbags and metal panels in front of the stained glass window to prevent them from bomb damage. And the population has swelled completely because so many people have fled the more dangerous parts of the country, and only certain numbers of them are able to afford to go further into Europe. So on the face of it, it all looks quite normal, but you'd hear these horror stories about how many refugees you've got crammed into small living spaces and having a pretty miserable time of it. And
but not as miserable as they had where they
come from. Exactly.
Yes, and Sabrina, we'll come to your question in a minute, but I want to hear a bit more about the actual Ukraine everyday life. I mean, were you able to get information about other parts of Ukraine, and what did you and your hosts talk about?
So there was a real range of people at the conference. So the first day of it was trade unionists. We were a largely union delegation, and that was kind of purpose, was to build links. And they said basically the functioning of their trade unions had just transformed because they'd had to kind of park a lot of their original campaigns and focus on just keeping their members alive. There was a pretty hair-raising account from a guy called Alexander Skriba, who's a railway worker and a railway trade union rep. And they were really badly targeted in the early days of the war, because obviously that's how you funnel stuff around in a war. So, I mean, pretty horrific stories from him, but also talking about how the union was largely preoccupied with getting stuff to their members. Like all these people who've never been in a war before, often quite young guys, suddenly thrown into war and have no idea what they're doing. And those trade union networks are keeping them alive to an extent. Their mates turn up with supplies or give them information. Alexander had done national service back in the day and was basically touring around the front being like, this is how you bandage stuff. This is how you identify where a mine is. It's such an impromptu, sudden thing that you can't guarantee that everyone knows what they're doing in a war.
No, not at all. I mean, I'd met some, when I was a student, I spent some time at an international thing where I met some people from Yugoslavia, and it was such a contrast for me coming from, at that time, England. And the Yugoslavian students were going on about, oh yeah, we do national service. We all have to learn how to dismantle a big gun.
Yeah.
There's a word for big gun. I'm not sure what it is. Big gun.
Blunderbuss.
Yes. And it was just around the time Tito was dying, and they knew their stuff militarily, and there was a real feeling that by training everybody in military matters, the country you didn't need an army particularly, because the country as a whole would all defend itself, which was an idea that the left in the UK would discuss at the time. But that sort of going off to a bit of a tangent. But what's it like in Ukraine? I mean, you said the person you met had done national service. Is there still national service? Is there a conscript army? Is there a big army? Have people generally,
there's not conscription at the moment, but men aren't allowed to leave the country. So they seem to be pretty much meeting what they need just because so many people are volunteering. And you do see a fair number of men who are knocking about and they've got fair reason to not be in the army, but so far they've not seemed to need to conscript people. One thing that I think has been a factor that maybe people didn't appreciate before the war is, because this is in a sense an ongoing conflict that's been going on for 8 years, there's a hell of a lot of people who've been reserves and stuff, so you've got quite a large amount of people to draw upon. But even people who aren't in the army, loads of the activists we met at the conference were saying like everyone feels the need to pile in as they can, including people you wouldn't expect necessarily to be involved in a war. So like we met anarchists who were like, well, you know, this wouldn't really be our bag, but at the end of the day, there's a fight on our hands of being conquered by Putin here. Yeah. So what are you going to do? A hell of a lot of volunteer work going on. But yeah, I mean, the thing that would keep coming up from talking to people is people just feel they need to do something to help because there's such a catastrophe unfolding. So you'll help in any other way. And it should be said also that a lot of the kind of left-wing or feminist or LGBT activism that had been happening before the war, that's obviously been disrupted in all kinds of ways, but it's still going on. Trade unionists are still fighting to keep their members safe, despite martial law depriving them of some of their rights. Feminists have in many ways got a lot more on their plates than they even had before the war, because of the sexual violence that's been used by Russian troops, but also the fact that you've got this huge displacement of refugees living sometimes 17 to a basement, struggling to feed themselves, struggling to feed their kids, surrounded by men who are often themselves traumatized. It's a breeding ground for domestic violence. But one interesting thing they were telling us in Lviv was, because you've got so many people displaced and coming to the Western cities, that also means that women's activists or gay rights activists or whatever, they're meeting up, having previously been hundreds of miles away from each other. So Lviv, in a kind of weird, ironic way, has become a little capital for the left and for human rights activists and for kind of pro-liberation people.
A hothouse of liberal debate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I was going to pick you up on that. And I mean, viewers do ring in or put another comment. Sabrina, we will come to you. I think it's Sabrina. We will come to you in a second once we've done a bit more on actual life in Ukraine. But I was going to pick you up on that and say, and certainly the mainstream media is all about men aren't allowed to leave the Ukraine, and the women and children have been the refugees. Is that what, I can't believe I'm saying this, but is that what we want? Should women be allowed and encouraged to fight as well? Why is it that women are being allowed to let go other than tradition? Is that something the feminists in the Ukraine agree with or not? Or
I can't speak for the feminist movement kind of all as a group. I can say that certainly one feminist activist and socialist activist, I should say, she could do both. One thing she was saying that was that lots of women have volunteered to join the army, and it's shot up from something really quite small to over 15% now. It's quite a lot higher than the amount in the British Army. But also that those women, many of them had been arguing to be involved in more near the front kind of combat related activities, and they were resisting the urge of their officers to be funneled off into some sort of auxiliary role. I think the feeling is so strong. People don't really like being put in a little box and said, oh, no, you have to go off and pack bandages in some warehouse out the back. People feel they want to be up there with it.
Well, yes, we certainly heard at the beginning of the war, didn't we, that there are a couple of women speaking out on social media, with guns they had found, and wanting to defend themselves with, and a couple of older women as well. Sort of saying, Russians coming this way. Look what I've had since the Second World War lying around. I've got my granddads to
come in handy.
So, yes, don't underestimate women's desire to be involved. What was the feeling in Ukraine about where this war is going? Is there a response to the failure of the Putin, invade it quickly? Theory if people still got hope?
I imagine it varies a lot depending on your direct experience of the war. I imagine some people must just be in deep despair. But from the overall public vibe I got was that morale was high, precisely because, as you say, this war that was expected to result in a Russian victory very swiftly, that hasn't happened, and Ukraine's done a lot better than was expected. So if I can generalize based on the experiences that I had from talking to people, it's that people were very aware of what a difficult situation they were in, but they're very determined. And I think there was a building sense of we could do better than people gave us credit for.
Yes, I mean you think of Ukraine as a much smaller country than Russia.
Yeah.
In which case, how is this happening? It's sort of, it does seem strange. Is it just because there's actually a load of Western weapons gone in, or?
I think that helps. It certainly helps. I imagine it would be over a great deal quicker if there hadn't been financial support, military support from the West. But I also think it's, well, I mean, look, the Russian army is a lot bigger than the Ukrainian army, but the Ukrainian army's advantage is it is all in Ukraine. It's easier to fight on defensive territory. It's easier to defend a city than it is to conquer it, and it's easy to motivate people if they're very clear of what the stakes are. A slogan that the Ukrainians have been saying is if Russia stops fighting, there'll be no more war. If you Ukrainians stop fighting, there'll be no more Ukraine. So it's not an issue of mobilizing for the Ukrainians because people are fully aware of the stakes, whereas Russia, they're running into trouble, and they're having to turn the screws tighter and tighter to generate the resources and the manpower for it.
Okay. Which sort of now brings us on really to Sabrina's question, which is very simple. Will transatlantic unity last? And yeah, that is actually, simply put, a really interesting question as to whether this war has created alliances between Western countries that weren't there before and are actually going to last. I mean, are we seeing yet another reinvention of a new world order?
Quite possibly. I mean, the answer is I don't know. To be honest,
no, I'm not asking you to predict.
But I think. I mean, on the one hand, you can think yes, and you see that some countries on the border of Russia have been massively spooked by it, and then Finland and probably Sweden joining NATO. Yeah. On the other hand, the fault lines are there, so I think it's quite clear that the German government is fully aware how reliant it is on Russian fossil fuel, and is actually quite trepidatious about what it's willing to do. So, on the one hand, I suppose you've got a unifying influence on Western governments. On the other hand, like, there's plenty of potentially divergent interests as well.
I mean, Sabrina, I think, I think I've said on this program before, my view is that the fulcrum was in 2008 with the World Economic Crisis. And I think a lot of things, we're seeing a political fallout. So we've got the populism of Trump, Macron, and somebody else was very populist as well. I've always used to have three examples. I've forgotten who they are now. Well, Boris Johnson, to some extent, is part of that. And they are people who believe in going forward, but not through austerity, it seems. But through free markets. And don't worry, capitalism will come to the rescue, which seems to me bizarre. And then you've got the sort of more traditional capitalists in running the EU. But all these tensions are sort of, it's like one earthquake, which has lots of little aftershocks. And COVID didn't help. But, we've not found a way of running the world with economic success. And so there are still far too many people paying the price of the fact that the few, the rich and powerful, are not actually able to run the planet successfully. And so you've got lack of response to climate change as well. And I think we're in a period of turmoil. So, Sabrina, I don't think transatlantic unity will last. All it needs is Joe Biden or his successor not to win the next US election and Trump to come back, or son of Trump or whatever. And we're actually into a whole different ballgame again. I mean, Biden's not been hugely popular, but still, I think we've got a call coming through. So, hello, caller. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Serena. I'm calling from London.
Our caller's gone silent. Here we are.
Can you hear
me?
Hello,
caller.
Can you hear me?
Yes. So I'm not quite sure where the
Hello?
world is going, but I think we're still in a period of turmoil myself, rather than stability one way or another.
If I could make one little, but it's not directly to do with the question, but on this thing of is the West homogeneously supporting Ukraine? One thing that I found really interesting was the Ukrainian activist we spoke to said, on the face of it, Britain and Boris Johnson's very popular because I think for his own reasons, he wanted to make a big show of sending arms. But on the other hand, you've got the fact that Britain has actually done terribly at letting in refugees from Ukraine. And on top of that, the Foreign Office pioneered this law, which is still making its kind of complicated route through the Ukrainian parliament, which would essentially neoliberalize Ukrainian labor relations and make it much easier to sack workers without labor legislation. So the Ukrainian trade unionists and socialists we were speaking to were like, do people in Britain know that this is going on? And like on the face of it, like Britain's supposed to be like the friend of plucky Ukrainians, and at the same time is pushing through this like really unpleasant bit of Thatcherite legislation that's going to punish Ukrainian workers at their worst moment when their lives are already in an absolute state. It's going to make it easier to sack them at a whim, to trample over their rights. So that was one of the bits of information that made me think, well, this is worthwhile going. It's like we should be sort of raising a bit of a holler about that over here.
Do we have a caller coming through? I think that didn't work for some reason. Yes, I think we're still in a period of turmoil internationally. And is there anything else you saw in Ukraine that people would be interested by about how the war is actually affecting everyday lives? I mean, are people in touch with relatives? I appreciate you were just in the west of the country, but are people in touch with friends and relatives elsewhere in Ukraine?
Because of the nature of people fleeing, you're surrounded by people who've come from places like Kherson or Mariupol or all these places which have been or are going through absolute hell. You'd be having a perfectly normal political discussion with someone, with a group of people in a bar, and then some young person would just casually drop into conversation, oh, my 14-year-old sister's in Mariupol, which is being flattened. Looks like the Russians have finally taken the whole of it in the last couple of days. But yeah, and it's very sobering. And one thing that, I mean, like I was so grateful that people found so much time to tell us information, to answer our questions, to be quite indulgent with what I imagine were questions to them, which sounds a bit stupid. When they've got an awful lot on their plate, and they must be going through a lot of personal anguish.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think any of us can really imagine what it's like to have your home that you thought was your home just taken away. I think I've said on the programme before, it's something that happened to my mother as well. She lived under Russian occupation. And it's just, I'm going to say saddening, but I can't think of a worse word. She had reports of Russian troops using sexual violence in 1944. And that it's still going on today. It's something that the women's movement has been making progress on, but I think we need to come back to when we've had this discussion. So what? I mean, people, I think, at the start of the war wanted to do something. And how can we raise money? Oh, so before that, let me just make a comment on the dual standards, because I think that will affect our community here. With why aren't we shipping the Ukrainians to Rwanda? If other refugees that get to the UK don't deserve to live in the UK on a summary inspection, but should go off and go seek refuge in Rwanda. Why is it that we're being so nice to the Ukrainians? I mean, obviously, I prefer us to be nice to both sorts, but I think our community in East London is particularly, cross and outraged by that.
Understandably, I mean, the first thing I'd say is I'm not sure. I don't think we can be that sure that we are being that nice to Ukrainians. I mean, all these British families have volunteered to take them in, and in fact, they're finding it incredibly difficult to get through the visa program. There was some talk, I remember, in the news a couple of days ago about, are Ukrainians going to be sent to Rwanda? So I don't think it can be ruled out. But I absolutely take the point that there is a big double standard there. The British government has been treating all migrants and also refugees terribly for so long, and it's been able to talk out the side of its mouth and fail to live up to its obligations to refugees from places like Syria for ages, and the fact that they find it harder to get away with that to white European people than they do to people from the Middle East or Africa, I think is very telling about the racist attitudes in our society. What I'd say though is we should campaign for to let Ukrainian refugees in, and we should also level that up to everyone else. So we should fight as hard as we can to let Ukrainian refugees in and make that the standard for all people. You get some people who are kind of a bit sympathetic to Russia, trying to play the two groups off of each other, like to say, oh well, aren't these Ukrainians kind of privileged white Europeans, and really we should be directing our focus elsewhere. No, we should treat everyone fairly from wherever they are, and there should be a consistent standard across the board. Another thing I'd like to kind of bring back into focus is the guy largely responsible for the worst of the killing of civilians in Syria is the same guy doing it to Ukrainians. Like the model that is being unleashed on Mariupol by Putin is a model that he developed in Chechnya and in Syria against Muslim people.
Hello, caller. Lovely to hear you. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Serena. I did try to call earlier, but the line cut off.
Yes.
I just want to say your program's really interesting, actually.
Oh, good.
I just wanted to kind of also highlight that I've got friends that are in Russia as well, and at the moment they also are having a hard time as well. Obviously, they're not enjoying the war or what's going on at the moment. So it's just not one-sided. There are people against what's happening.
Well, we said at the beginning, that Putin was hoping for a quick war to distract people from his domestic agenda. Your friends in Russia, is there poverty? Is the life hard in Russia?
Yeah, it is. They are going through it really hard at the moment. There are, I've got friends here in London as well that have family in Russia, and when I talk to her, she cries a lot. She's like, I can't get hold of my mom. Her close family members. Even the network there isn't being great, so she's finding it hard as well. And it's just, I don't know. It's a two-way thing. We don't see the other side of it as well.
It just makes you despair, doesn't it? That the actions of just a few men.
You need to see both sides of it as well, because there are, it's sad what's happening.
But your friends and families of your friends in Russia, what do they think about the invasion of Ukraine? What do they think about the war?
They're totally against it. I've got a friend that's married to a Ukrainian, and it makes it hard to, none of them are going on sides and stuff, but it's just the fact that it's just breaking up,
Because we've heard a lot in the media, haven't we, that the Russian people don't know what's going on because all the media just gives the Kremlin line, and
exactly. And it's sad. It's sad what's happening. But there's a lot happening in Palestine as well. They've gone for 74 years of hardship.
Yeah.
But we can't even get them here as well. That's another thing. You were talking about Ukraine and coming to England, and I was just thinking there are people that want to sponsor Palestinians to come here, but that has never been mentioned.
Absolutely, that doesn't come out, does it? And I think there's been things on social media comparing the killing of the Al Jazeera journalist recently.
That was so heartbreaking.
And somebody did some very good a comparison showing the world's press talking about her being having died in Palestine, but a journalist who was recently killed in Ukraine. The reports were, the journalist has been has been killed, and the difference in the language used about victims in Palestine. Yeah. Well, Sabrina, thank you very much for your call. We're coming to the end of our program.
Good luck with the program. It's really good.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
All right, take care. Bye.
Cheers. Bye. And we were hoping to, you've really sort of started again, taking us into the sort of final bit of what we need to talk about, which is what we actually do. And certainly here in East London, we have an active Palestine Solidarity campaign. And in fact, some of them have been on the programme, and I'm sure will be again. But in terms of the new refugee laws and what's happening from the messages we're getting from Planet Priti Patel, we really ought to do more on to oppose this immigration bill and Priti Patel's plans for refugees. So let's put that on our agenda in East London. But what else were your trade union contacts in Ukraine sort of suggesting that we might?
Well, I mean, I think there's two things. On the one hand, there's trying to physically get practical help. So some European trade unions have set up convoys to take aid to Ukraine. There's also certain practical bits of industrial action that have been popping up around Europe. People might have seen in the news that in British ports, Russian oil tankers were turned back by the port workers because they didn't want to be helping the Russian war. Similar stuff has also gone in Sweden. So there's that kind of practical stuff. But I think also it's, and I'm coming at this as a trade unionist, that's kind of my focus. Trade unions are big democratic membership bodies that have a voice, however diminished by the past couple of decades, in political life, and we should be raising things. So we should be, a lot of trade unions have a formal link with the Labour Party. We have a certain influence in what the Labour Party does. So we should be raising the slogans to open the borders to refugees, to send aid, to allow Ukraine to get its hands on the hardware it needs to keep on fighting the war. But also, there's other things. There's the fact that Ukraine is currently crippled by international debt. So at the same time as it's in this existential struggle to keep going, it's getting deep into debt that it's struggling to repay. So one practical thing that the British government could do, if it actually cared and wasn't just mainly bothered about posturing, is you could cancel that international debt. You could stop using the Foreign Office to interfere in Ukrainian politics to make it easier for corporations and harder for workers and the poor. So I think, two things. We should be doing practical stuff to get support to Ukraine, but also we should be using our political voice to try and shift things.
So in terms of the trade unions, what is the logjam there? Because sometimes our trade union leaders have been a bit behind what the membership are quite looking for. So is it that trade unions are not speaking out about the plight of their colleagues in Ukraine? Or is it that the government isn't listening? I mean, you said perhaps we could convince the Labour Party, and sort of, I think many of us would say good luck with that one.
Well, yeah, but, I hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, but maybe there are some Labour MPs. Usually, there's a few Labour MPs who will take forward issues, and we've got one in Tower Hamlets, Apsana Begum, who's I don't know what she's done on Ukraine, but I'm sure if there's any time left, somebody will ring in and tell us. But is there any group of people like our local MP who might do a bit more practical work with trade unionists on this?
Yeah, I mean, by all means, get in contact with your councillors, with your MPs. There's all kinds of organisations. One that I've been involved with is the Ukraine Solidarity campaign, that has been trying to organise people who want to help to find useful things of doing. You were saying that many of your viewers and listeners here have been very concerned about what's been going on in Syria. The Ukraine Solidarity campaign and the Syria Solidarity campaign have begun to do some stuff together because they see the shared, the overlap there. So by all means, look up stuff like the Ukraine Solidarity campaign if you want to get more involved.
I think we're sort of drawing to a close now, and I know that your delegation, I believe, has got a meeting in central London, I think maybe tomorrow night. I don't know if you want to tell people about that. I might have got the details wrong.
Yeah, no, it's
or maybe they haven't told you.
It is on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's tomorrow.
No, next week. It's Wednesday next week.
Right, Wednesday next week. That's why we call this the Tuesday show, so I can try to remember what day of the week
Wednesday,
it actually
25th, isn't it? I'm going to get loads of texts now. And that's going to be in Marchmont Street in Bloomsbury.
There's quite a nice community centre in Marchmont Street, which is quite short. So if you're interested in hearing more about the delegation face to face, then do go along Marchmont Street.
I can't remember what time it is exactly, but I'm sure we can put something.
It'll be in the evening, and if you text me, then we'll pop it in East London News as well, and on the Vod Talk Facebook page. But I mean, not everybody from East London is going to be able to go that far.
Sure, understandably.
Many of us don't really head west at all. But we've got a big. I know we've got a following in Redbridge. I know some of you viewers are living in Redbridge, and you've got that Labour MP Wes Streeting out there. He seems to be quite stuck in with Mr. Starmer. Perhaps you could have a word with him and say, well, what practically is the Labour Party doing to support trade unionists in Ukraine, and see what his response is to that. So that's, again, another action that we can do.
Yeah, sure.
So, and it would be lovely to think that there was some way that women in the UK could support women in Ukraine as well, but maybe that's a question that's not been answered.
I'm sure. I wish I could give you some contact details, but I'm sure there is something to. The women's movement in Ukraine was some of the most kind of impressive people we spoke to. Like everything had been so badly disrupted by the war, but they're managing against all odds to scramble some really impressive stuff together. So yeah, if we can find any way of linking up between the British and Ukrainians on that front, I think that'd be very much appreciated.
Well, at the start, we started the month with a historic example of how politics and democracy is right on the agenda here in East London, and particularly here in the People's Borough, Tower Hamlets. So I think we all need to get back stuck in now to our political work. There's people out there who need our solidarity, and that's what we're going to have to get going and provide. Tom, thank you for making the trek from distant South London to come and join us here.
No, thanks very much for having me.
And talking about your trip. I think we've all found it very interesting, and thank you for making the effort to come here. And so, viewers, that's the end of our show for this evening, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, and good night.